Jane Yardley is a diabetes researcher and exercise expert. She completed her PhD in population and health at the University of Ottawa, where today she researches as a principal investigator for the University of Alberta at the Alberta Diabetes Institute. Her work primarily focuses on type 1 diabetes, but in the resistance training and high intensity intermittent intervals. So today she's going to tell us, introduce herself, and then some 5 things that we need to know about diabetes and exercise. So take it from there.
All right, thanks, Anissa. It was actually a lot of fun having Anissa in the lab. She's a star participant. So my name is Jane. The first thing I usually do when I introduce myself in one of these talks is I say, I don't have type 1 diabetes. I am a 5.5er, but I am someone who does really enjoy what I do, and I've spent a lot of time in the research world now learning everything that's out there and trying to add new information myself. I will also warn you that I have 2 very bratty felines in my house. I did just feed them in the hopes that they will go into a food coma, but if you do see a flash of fur, if I get Zoom bombed by my cat, I apologize. All right, so today I was asked to give you sort of a top 5 things to know about type 1 diabetes and exercise. And I figured that the best thing to start with would be, why should you exercise? There are some really great reasons. On top of all the benefits that people without diabetes would get from being physically active, if you have type 1 diabetes, there are additional benefits. And these are things that we've seen in studies several times over. So first of all, we've seen that it actually increases your lifespan, it increases longevity. And we're not talking by a couple of months, we're actually talking by a couple of years, and sometimes, 5 to 10 years here. Part of the reason why it increases your lifespan is because it decreases a lot of the things that are potential health risks when you have type 1 diabetes. Heart disease being one of them. Being physically active decreases that risk. Eyes, nerves, kidneys, these are all things that can potentially be negatively affected by type 1 diabetes, and they're all things that get a degree of protection when you're physically active. Maintaining a healthy body weight. Really important when you are injecting insulin and you want to maintain that insulin sensitivity. Having a healthy body weight is really important. Keeping your bones strong and your muscles and joints strong as you age, also really important, and there's some evidence that that might actually decline a little bit faster with type 1 diabetes than in people who don't have diabetes. So if you add in that exercise, it's going to ensure that you are able to be active and healthy as you age. I love this one. I think I'm preaching to the choir, but if you exercise, you're happier. And well, most people who exercise regularly know that. So the question I always ask when I do these presentations is, if a pill did all of this for you, wouldn't you take it every day in the maximum dose possible? And most of us already do that. I think a lot of people on this call today are probably very active as it is. To do it safely, though, with type 1 diabetes, there are, of course, several things that we have to think about. So I figured that number 2 in my top 5 would be to talk about adjusting insulin, because, of course, this is a big thing. It's more or less essential to avoid hypoglycemia. And the idea behind this, if you think about what insulin does, it's going to help the muscle, the liver, and all the cells, fat cells, take up glucose. But when you're exercising, your muscles can actually take up glucose on their own without insulin being available. What that does is it gives you a bit of a double whammy, where you're basically sucking glucose out of your blood and into your muscles. And that, of course, can cause a lot of problems. In order to adjust insulin well and properly, it needs to be done well in advance of exercise. So 90 minutes to 2 hours is basically what the guidelines are saying right now if you're using an insulin pump. And if you're using basal injections and sort of the basal bolus injections, you can adjust your basal the night before if you're going to be active the next day, or you have the option also of making that adjustment with the meal before you're about to go exercise. Without adjustments, it's almost guaranteed that you are going to need carbohydrate intake to keep your blood sugars up. So this is why that insulin adjustment prior to exercise is really important. There's a really good explanation for this is if you think about what your pancreas would normally do if it was working 100%. There's a really big difference between the insulin that your pancreas produces and the insulin that's made synthetically. So if you look at this diagram over here on the right, this orange peak that goes up really quickly and down really quickly, That is naturally produced insulin. Two things happen when you start to exercise. One, your nervous system sends a signal to your pancreas to say, hey, slow down on that insulin, we don't need as much of it. And number two, you get a slight drop in blood glucose, which your pancreas responds to by producing less insulin. It's a direct relationship. So within 5 minutes of starting exercise, if your pancreas is working properly, you end up with half as much insulin in your system. Unfortunately, if you are using synthetic insulin, that doesn't happen quite the same way. Obviously, you're putting it in either by a pump or by injection, and even the fastest acting insulin stays in your system for 2 to 4 hours in terms of trying to get that insulin down. It takes a lot longer to go down. And of course, it doesn't know once you start exercising. So that's why trying to get those adjustments done in advance is incredibly important, because otherwise you start exercising and that double whammy that I just mentioned, those muscles want to take in glucose already, and then you've got insulin also making sure that some of that glucose goes into storage. This is a fairly recent study out of Montreal. And what it's doing is kind of showing you the importance of making those adjustments before exercise. So these are all people who are using insulin pumps. And this is called a survival curve. So if you see the numbers are at 100, that means 100 people are, 100% of the people in the study, and in this case there were 22 of them, are not needing any type of supplementation to prevent hypoglycemia. Now over here you've got these reductions, T minus 40, T minus 20, and T0. T0 means they decreased their insulin, and in this case it was an 80% basal reduction. Either this is right before exercise, this is 20 minutes before exercise, and this is 40 minutes before exercise. And you can see by looking at this survival curve down here, the people who just turned off or turned down their pump right as they were starting to exercise, the majority of them, more than half of them, needed carbohydrates to prevent hypoglycemia during exercise. When they did it 40 minutes before exercise, most people were okay up until about 25 minutes, but then again, over 30% or close to 30% of these people also needed carbohydrates to prevent hypoglycemia during exercise. And I think hypoglycemia for this study was defined as around 3.3, so it was actually fairly low. I'm putting this one in here because this is one of the best reviews out there on exercise management and type 1 diabetes. It's a fairly recent reference, and it is available for free. If you go onto the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology website, make yourself a free account, you can download this article. It has lots of information and lots of suggestions. The other thing you can do is you can email Michael Riddell. I think he may even be on this call right now, but when I talked to him a little bit earlier this week, he said, yeah, just tell people to email me and I'll send them a copy. So I highly recommend this as a reference if you're wanting to know how to adjust for different types of activities. My point number 3 is that intensity matters. The reason for this, if you look at where the energy is stored and how you access it, you'll see that it's very different between aerobic, so lower intensity, and anaerobic, higher intensity exercise. Most of us are painfully aware of where we store our lipids. That's those bits that you can pinch on your body. That's your fat. Adipose tissue is your fat stores, what you find under the skin. That's where about 97% of your fat is stored. You have this little tiny bit in your muscle. This can be a fuel source for exercise. And then you've got this little bit in your blood, and usually that's going in transit from a place where it's stored to a place where it's being used. Now, if we look at glucose or at carbohydrates, close to 80% of the glucose in your body is stored as glycogen in your muscle. The important thing to remember here is that once glucose is stored in the muscle, it can't come back out. The cell puts a phosphate group on it, and that essentially traps it inside that muscle. Now, we do also have this almost 20% of glucose that's available in the liver, and that can come back out, provided we have the right situation. And then we have this tiny little bit in the blood. This has been described to me as a teaspoon of sugar in your entire circulatory system, which is around 5 liters of blood. So that's a very, very small number. And if that number is not getting replaced with glucose coming from other areas, namely this liver storage, it drops fairly quickly during exercise. If we look at the table on the left-hand side here, you'll see that actually the main source of fuel for aerobic exercise is fat. But the second source that your body likes to tap into is glucose, and that's blood glucose. It's not the glycogen that's in your liver. It's not the glycogen that's in your muscles. It's really what's in your blood. And that's why with aerobic exercise, especially if you've got higher insulin levels, that's why we see that blood glucose level drop really quickly. Now, on this right-hand side, what we're seeing is that glucose is actually your main source of fuel for high-intensity activity. But the key point here is where it's stored and what activates it. You have epinephrine that comes out. That's adrenaline with high-intensity activity. And that's going to give you more access to this liver glycogen. That stuff that's stored in the liver can come back out. And adrenaline is one of the main things that's going to help you get it out. This is an adaptive response. It's your fight, flight, or freeze response. What your body does is it mobilizes the resources that you need to either fight or run away from a threat. You'll know what this feels like as you're getting ready, or as you're exercising hard, or even as something scares the crap out of you. Your heart rate goes up, your breathing goes up, your pupils dilate. And at the same time, you're mobilizing fuels. You've got a dumping of fatty acids and a dumping of glucose into the bloodstream so that it can go out to the muscles and provide them with energy while you're doing this high intensity activity. And the trick here is that oftentimes your liver is going to release more glucose than your muscles actually need. And that's why we're going to see sometimes either an increase or a bit of stability, but more often than not a bit of an increase when you're doing sustained high intensity activities. And there are some studies that have shown that you can use this to your advantage to stop that drop in glucose that can happen during aerobic exercise. So this one over here, what they did is they had the same people do either aerobic activity at a very sort of low to moderate intensity, 40% of the effort level. And then they had them come back and do a second one where they did 4-second sprints every 2 minutes. That's not a lot of sprinting, but it actually does enough to keep blood glucose higher throughout the exercise and after exercise. We've seen also that another anaerobic activity or high intensity activity, weightlifting, can have a bit of a stabilizing effect as well. This is actually some work from my PhD where I showed that if you lift weights, it doesn't have a huge impact on your glucose during that weightlifting session. Sometimes we see drops of 1, maybe 2 millimoles per liter, but it also has a protective effect against that drop during aerobic exercise. So for those of you that like to combine aerobic and resistance exercise, you know, if you're going to the gym and you get in there and you're like, oh, I'm a little on the lower side than where I want to be. Should I take some carbs or should I just do it? If you're on that fence, sometimes lifting weights before doing your aerobic activity will give you that little bit of stability that you need. And on the other side, if you go in there and you're like, whoa, holy crap, that's higher than I want it to be, that aerobic exercise will bring you down. And then the resistance exercise afterwards, we found actually sort of helped bring glucose back up again, or at least stop the fall that was happening during exercise. Now, this is a bit of a more recent point. So it's one that we don't find in a lot of guidelines just yet. I say it's more recent in that it's been brought up again more recently. There were a few studies that were done, small studies, about 20 years ago. And basically they showed that time of day is important. Now, when I'm talking about time of day, I'm specifically talking about the difference between fasting exercise first thing in the morning and then doing the exercise after you've had a meal. And most of the time, the comparison is going to be sort of afternoon or evening exercise. Here's one of the earlier studies showing that when you went for a walk before breakfast, this is what we're seeing here is this upward inflection. So there's a bit of an increase in glucose walking before breakfast. And this is the walk after breakfast, which is a pretty big decrease. Now, of course, here they also had breakfast in between, which had some carbohydrates. And that's also part of the reason why we saw glucose going up. But explaining, going down over here, but explaining why it's going up over here, that's another story. On average, with most types of exercise, what we see is if you are exercising fasting before you've had anything to eat, there is a tendency for glucose to increase. Whereas if you're doing it after having a meal, there is a tendency to decrease. And some of that has to do with insulin on board. You've got less insulin first thing in the morning. And it might also be related to things like cortisol and growth hormone. These are other things that tend to be higher in the morning, and they actually promote fat as a fuel source during exercise. So they could help sparing some of that glucose. This is weightlifting. Morning exercise, glucose goes up. Afternoon exercise, glucose goes down. And the interesting thing is if we actually took this curve the whole way out, it kind of went up for a little while longer. So if you are a person who tends to go a little bit higher after lifting weights, you might want to opt for the afternoon exercise because this morning, this fasting exercise did tend to show quite a bit of prolonged hyperglycemia. The last point that I want to make today, and again, I think I am preaching to the choir on this one, but technology is your friend. I want to point out a few things that you may not be aware of, but most of you probably use a lot of your devices already to their maximum capacity. We did do a study on this. We called it Boot Camp 360, and we invited patients and healthcare providers into the lab, and we gave them 3 things. Education, so we did a 20-minute session. This is the type of exercise that you're going to do, and this is what you can expect to see with your glucose. And then we gave them a supervised exercise session in the lab, and we gave them a real-time CGM. They had a Dexcom on them. At the end of this, we did 4 weeks in a row, 4 different types of exercise, and then we invited them in for focus groups and said, hey, what was the most useful? Everyone said the CGM. It allowed them to have a better idea of what was going on. Seeing is believing. But they also felt more confident because they could see what their glucose was doing. Those trend arrows gave them an idea of whether or not they needed to supplement soon or not. They had less overcorrection before, during, and after exercise. And for people who are using exercise as a means of weight management, this is going to be very important. And they just overall felt safer while they were exercising. And of course, you have that option of having alarms as well after exercise, overnight, so that fear of hypoglycemia can be decreased a bit, or at least helped out by having the ability to see this. Of course, insulin pumps, as I mentioned earlier, you can make those adjustments that allow you to keep your insulin lower during exercise. It also helps with post-exercise because sometimes we tend to see a rebound, and to make small adjustments to your insulin dosage is easier if you are using an insulin pump. Real-time continuous glucose monitoring, in addition to that safety net and that confidence that I was talking about on the last slide. Another one to really be aware of is knowing if you have been low before you're about to go work out or go for a bike ride or go for a walk or a run or even go gardening. Having been low once in the last 24 hours is actually a really good predictor of whether or not you're going to drop quickly during exercise. It affects your body's ability to handle the changes in glucose during exercise. And so what we tend to see is if you have one low, you have repeated lows. And if you have a low before exercise, you'll probably see things drop a little faster during exercise. So having that real-time CGM can help you prevent some of this by either making a more aggressive adjustment to your insulin prior to exercise or bringing more carbohydrates with you, knowing that because you've already had these lows, that you might be more inclined to have them during exercise. And sometimes it also takes more carbohydrate to treat these multiple lows and get out of them. The last one that I have here is the ability to find trends with specific types and timing of exercise. For those of you that love numbers, CGM is a wonderful tool. You can try to do the same exercise session at the same time of day with the same intensity and eat the same meals beforehand, and then you tweak one thing at a time. And tweaking that one thing at a time will allow you to really dial in what works well for you. Now, of course, there are always going to be exceptions, and it's not always going to be perfect, but it does at least give you more tools in the toolbox to understand what's going on and to figure out some of the best approaches for you. The ability to treat a low or a high before it happens, those trend arrows, as I mentioned before, extremely useful, and will be able to help you prevent some of the incidents that you might otherwise have. All right, I'm leaving you on this last slide here. These are some of the resources that I sometimes recommend for people with type 1 diabetes. And they're the ones that I get the best feedback from when I train new students that are coming into my lab and I want them to learn about type 1 diabetes. I give them some reading, and these are often the ones that I give them. The one on the right here is a little less known than some of these other three. And this one for competitive athletes, I've recommended it before. It's basically a workbook that helps you plan your food for a couple of days before sort of practices and competition. All of these are available online. So all you have to do is do a little search for them. You can either get them through Amazon or through other publishing companies, but they are available out there. And last but not least, at the bottom here, you have my email address, and I am happy to answer any questions that don't get addressed in the next 5 minutes, I guess we have now. But do feel free to send me an email if you want any of the studies that I talked about today. If you want any more information, I am happy to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane. We do have a few questions in the chat box. We have one that says, I like to go for 20-minute walks on an evening and seem to go low no matter what I do. Exception only walking for 10 minutes. How much decrease in basal would you recommend, and how long would you set a temp basal for?
So if we go back to some of the recommendations that are published out there, the recommendation obviously is to make that adjustment sort of an hour and a half to 2 hours before exercise, and then to maintain it throughout exercise. Everyone's a little bit different. How much to decrease by? Right now, anywhere from, I think, 50 to 100% is what is recommended. If you do actually suspend your insulin, usually less than an hour is the recommendation. But it is a good idea to make those adjustments if you're finding that you're constantly going low when you're doing that activity.
Awesome. We have another one. Does exercise make use of enough glucose that you could, in theory, go for many hours with zero insulin on board or basal and still not be very high if you are type 1 diabetic? So this person once forgot to turn the pump back on once they were hiking in the mountains, and 6 hours later, they're still below 12 millimole. Their doctor said that shouldn't be possible, and maybe they might have some residual pancreas function. Been diabetic for about 40 years. Do you have any thoughts of why this might happen? They're also very insulin and exercise sensitive.
Okay, that was a lot of information. Let me see if I can piece that apart. In terms of residual beta cell function, this is something that we're starting to see more and more studies about, and that there are actually a lot more people who have residual beta cell function than were initially suspected. So that is always a possibility. In terms of going for a very long time without any insulin on board, that usually leads to problems. So if you're not having any difficulties going that long without insulin on board, I would suspect that what your doctor has said is probably correct. Was there another part of that question that I'm missing there, Anissa?
I think that kind of covered it.
Okay.
We have another one from Mike. What is your research up? What is your research up to now?
We have a few different studies going on. One that we're trying to finish up is related to the menstrual cycle in women, because we are wondering if in the luteal phase, which is basically the week before women have their period, there's some evidence showing that they are more prone to hyperglycemia, and I suspect that could mean more insulin on board going into exercise, and therefore a greater risk of hypoglycemia. So that's one of the studies we're looking at. We're also looking at consistency of exercise responses with resistance exercise, and also playing around with exercise timing on that one. And we do have one that we are finally finishing up on, more or less on kidney function, but kind of looking at the difference between starting with really high glucose and starting within the range that's recommended, and seeing if it affects electrolyte balance if you're doing a 45-minute exercise session when your sugars are really high. So that's kind of what we're at.
That's really interesting, and I can't wait to see the results or anything you guys find. We have another quick question. If there's residual insulin function, does it blink in and out? And how do you find out if you do have some?
All right, I'll answer the second part of that. That's not really my area of expertise, but I'll see what I can do here. There's something that can be measured called C-peptide. And C-peptide is basically what gets cleaved off of insulin when your body produces it naturally and releases it. So if there is C-peptide in circulation in the body, that's usually an indication that the pancreas is producing some insulin. Now, what was the first part of that question?
If it just kind of blinks in out, or if it's a gradual process.
That I'm not sure about. My instinct would be to say that it's intermittent, but at the same time, that I have a feeling is probably also extremely variable. I can't really answer that question with confidence, but I can look that up. If the person wants to email me, I'll see if I can find any more information for them.
Awesome. Okay, we have another one. After extreme intense exercise, will the blood sugar be impacted if you overtax your heart? If so, how do you deal with overtaxing your heart? Is that just a trial and error sort of thing to figure out what is that point is? This person's able to handle the exercise and really enjoy intense exercise, but sometimes it seems like they can't control their blood sugars after very intense.
Okay. So it's not unusual that after very intense exercise, you see sugars go up and continue to go up for quite a while. We're not 100% sure why that happens, but it could be that during those activities, you get lactate produced, and lactate can be used as a fuel source, which supplements glucose. So that means that you're using the lactate instead of your glucose, basically, and then your liver's still kicking it out because you've still got adrenaline and all those wonderful hormones that come out when you do really high intensity activity. One thing that I've seen firsthand in the lab, there's no published literature on this, or at least none that I can think of, that will curb a little bit of that really big spike that happens and tends to continue after exercise, is doing a slightly longer aerobic cool down. So if you give yourself time to do sort of a 10 to 15 minute, really low intensity aerobic cool down, it does tend to, at least anecdotally, bring those sugars back under control and give you a bit more stability in the hours after exercise. It's at least one thing to try.
Yeah, I love that suggestion. I implement it for hard hockey games, and I see a really big difference. So I learned that from you. So another one is this person's currently cycling across Canada's 6 Summer Project, and they're able to manage things during the day, but their blood sugar often dives throughout the night. Are you able to speak into this?
I've heard different things. There's actually some work going on right now, which is really interesting, with the Novo Nordisk cycling team, where they're looking at multi-day stage races to see what's going on overall throughout the day and night when there are long bouts of exercise. From what I recall with these studies, it seems to be that the first few days are the worst, and then things seem to even out a little bit after that. And even talking to somebody like Sebastian Saskell, who ran across Canada, after the first, I think he said 3 or 4 weeks, he was back up to his normal insulin levels and wasn't having as many problems with the lows overnight. In the meantime, some of the things that are recommended by dietitians are bedtime snacks with low glycemic index carbohydrates, so slow release carbohydrates that you can have overnight, or a mix of protein and carbohydrate so that it slows down the speed at which those carbohydrates are going to be absorbed by the gut and released into the system.
Sweet. All right, another one. Is it okay to work out if your sugars are high, or should you wait until they drop to better levels?
If you want to go by the book on the recommendations for this one, usually the first thing you want to do is check your ketones. If your ketones are high, then you most likely want to follow the recommendations of taking some insulin and waiting for things to come back in, especially if you're not feeling great. If your ketones aren't high and you're feeling okay and you've been a little bit higher for a little while, most people will say that you can go ahead and do some exercise, but maybe keep the intensity down until your sugars are under control, and then at that point figure out how much time you have left and whether you want to change up your intensity.
Sweet. So yeah, tons of, I love all these questions. Even with turning off this person's basal completely for 1.5 hours before exercise, 3 hours after eating, and then decreasing mealtime bolus, they still need carbs to finish a bike ride around 45 minutes plus. Do you have any suggestions for this?
Well, I guess the question is, okay, so that you said they're turning off 90 minutes before?
90 minutes before, and they're eating 3 hours before, and decreasing mealtime bolus. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like they're doing all the right things. I guess the question is, when you're looking at something like that, what the combination of carbs and protein and fat in the meal are. If it's a meal that has a lot of fat in it, then the carbohydrates don't kick in until a little bit later. And if it's all carbohydrates, then those are basically gone by the time you get onto the bike. So that's one of those more complicated questions where the composition of the meal is also going to be a little bit important. But normally suspending insulin 90 minutes before exercise would do the trick. And that's actually a lot of, like it's a pretty big decrease. So this may also be one of those questions of, residual beta function. That one's a really hard question to answer. But if they want to email me with a little more detail, I'll be happy to make some suggestions.
Sweet. Okay, here's another crazy question. Does altitude and climbing make your blood sugar go up or down?
I am not sure about the answer to that one. I know it has an effect. And I wish I could remember, there is not a lot of literature on that. So most of the evidence out there is anecdotal anyway. And the problem that you're also going to find with climbing is if you're doing finger pokes, for example, to check your glucose, those strips rely on oxygen, and the higher you are, the less oxygen is available. So it does actually affect the accuracy of some of the equipment. So that's where you would be better off with a continuous glucose monitor. Off the top of my head, I can't say that I can give an answer to that one right away, but again, happy to look up the information.
Nice. So is it possible for a type 1 diabetic for a few years, but living without bolusing, meaning they only have long-acting insulin, meaning only with long-acting insulin with keto and exercise? So is it possible for someone to just be on long-acting insulin in a low-carb diet?
Anything's possible. Metabolism is extremely variable. A very low carbohydrate diet does cut out some of the need for insulin with meals, and so the basal could, in theory, cover most of that. What you want to be careful with there, and we don't know a lot about this because these very low carbohydrate diets are a more recent thing that people are trying, is if you have very little carbohydrate coming in, you have very little ability to store carbohydrate. So that could mean that your glycogen stores are depleted in the liver and in your muscles, which could affect your ability to do high intensity activity or even the risk of post-exercise hypoglycemia. And again, that's just sort of keeping your eye on things, because right now we don't have any studies to give us a lot of evidence for that one.
Sweet. Okay, this person, very impressive. They're a professional dancer and often does 8 hours a day with a few 15-minute breaks and lunch. Because every show is really different and dance styles vary, they often adjust insulin rates according to specific shows and run into hypoglycemia. Do you recommend a specific snack that is healthy and that has some good carbs and proteins to keep their sugars stable during their exercise?
I'm not a dietitian. And off the top of my head, I'm just thinking, well, what would I have? And I tend to go towards things like peanut butter and jam sandwiches, just because you've got that combination of carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Chocolate milk is another one that has a good combination of carbohydrate, fat, and protein. So anything that's going to give you a little bit of everything is going to, give your muscles what they need, allow you to maintain your blood sugars. And if you're putting the carbohydrates with fat and protein, it usually gives you that slower release over time, so that you have a bit more protection over time. Those are the 10 types of snacks I would gravitate towards.
Great. I have 2 more questions for you. So opposing to a question we had previously where we had nocturnal hypoglycemia, this person on days when they exercise intensely, most certainly long distance biking, they see spikes in the middle of the night, and wondering if you had any thoughts of nocturnal hyperglycemia.
Okay, that could be a couple of things. It also depends on when those spikes come, if it's related to the dawn phenomenon, because that can start happening at around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And you know, spikes in the middle of the night, adrenaline can come from various sources. So depending on how vigorous your dreams are, if you're moving around a lot in your sleep, you know, you could start seeing increases in glucose just related to adrenaline in a sleep state, you know, while you're dreaming and stuff. Depending on how long insulin was suspended for, or at least decreased for, you could see sustained hyperglycemia after exercise. But if it's just something that's spiking in the middle of the night, that could also just be one of those things where we all have different cycles of metabolism. And I have seen people who are using insulin pumps make adjustments for 1 or 2 hours here or there, where they know that they're accustomed to seeing these random spikes in their glucose.
Awesome. Okay. I'm sorry, we keep on getting a lot of questions, but sadly we're over time, so I'm going to leave you with one final one. You know, before I say this one, and you can say where you can contact you, just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today, Jane. We really appreciate it. And it was a quick session, but it was really valuable and very concentrated. So the 3 research topics that you just mentioned that you're working on, where can we find the end results once they're completed?
Ooh, that's a good question. That depends which journals think they're worthy of publication. I usually try to keep my website, my U of A website, up to date with my most recent publications. I might be a little bit behind on it right now, but usually my last 5 or my 5 most important recent ones, or whatever you want to consider them, are on my website at the University of Alberta, my webpage. So if you look up Jane Yardley, University of Alberta, you should be able to link to some of my publications from there.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today. Like I said, thank you very much, and hope to see you at the concert tonight with a really special guest with Crystal Bowsock. So really excited for that.
Okay, thank you.